everyone, and welcome to the Focus Group podcast. I'm Sarah Longwell, publisher of The Bulwark, and this week we're talking about third parties. Complaining about our two-party options has become a national pastime during election season, but getting people to agree on what an alternative would look like is tricky. I myself have always been third-party curious ever since Donald Trump came along. But even though it's difficult to come up with that alternative, my guest today thinks that he's found that alternative. You may remember Andrew Yang from the 2020 Democratic presidential primaries. He also ran for mayor of New York City in 2021, and he is the author of the book Forward, Notes on the Future of Our Democracy, which is on my bookshelf. And I'm going to lay my cards on the table. I'm skeptical of the third party idea. I'm especially worried about a third party putting Donald Trump in the White House again in 2024. Andrew and I have discussed this privately in the past, but now we're going to discuss it publicly with input from our focus groups. Andrew, welcome. Thanks for being here.
Hey, Sarah. Thanks for having me. Congrats on the Bulwark. It's great stuff.
Oh, thanks. So the Forward Party that you founded, the platform includes things like ranked choice voting, term limits, and a series of ways that you think the government could run more efficiently and effectively. Why don't you make your case, just to start, for why you think we need a third party?
Well, sure, Sarah. And I think you're a great test case. I believe that you were, and maybe still are, a Republican, have been for quite some time. But there are a lot of folks who I know in the Republican Party who became deeply concerned about the party after Trump came into power. And I think that's gotten worse, not better. You have a diminishing number of moderates or people who voted for the infrastructure package or voted to impeach Donald Trump. And the case that I'd make is that this is rational in the sense that the political incentives now will drive political figures in very specific directions. And I've spoken to some folks, as you have, who voted to impeach Trump, and they had death threats against themselves, their families. Like, there are really immense personal ramifications. So you have to ask yourself, okay, why is this happening? And then is this going to get better or worse? But the reason why you started the Bulwark, which I give you a ton of credit for, is that you know that there's a problem with our media organizations where they separate people into ideological tribes. They give people what they want to hear, and then that's how they make more money. And then social media pours gasoline on all of these dynamics. So these are relatively recent phenomena. Cable news came up in, let's call it, the late 80s. So you're looking at maybe 35 years of this polarization that is driving us into our corners. And unfortunately, it's not going to end well. It's going to result in growing political violence and strife and dysfunction. And so in this situation, you have to ask, well, what is a real path forward? And path one, which I'm sure many people who listen to you are hoping for, is that the Republican Party will become more moderate, more rational, more principled. Maybe you'd want some kind of reformation of the Democratic Party as well, because there are people who are concerned about some things in the Democratic Party.
Yeah, these sound terrific.
But then you have to ask yourself, it's like, do you think that's going to happen? And I'm going to tell you, it's not going to happen. There's no reason to think it's going to happen. The forces I described are getting more powerful, not less. So after you make that acceptance, then you think, okay, like, what is our path out of this? And then that leads you to what 62% of Americans have concluded, which is that we have to have an option beyond the duopoly and move beyond the two-party system.
Okay, so I agree with all of your framing for everything that's wrong. Let me push back on one particular piece before we go to our focus group folks. You cited the 61% number. Now, I know for a fact, after talking to these voters for all these years, that those 61% do not all want the same thing. And so I guess my question would be, is it that you think there should be many parties, or do you think there should be one third party that you think specifically appeals to a broad coalition that, like, people don't see yet because we're separated into these tribes that we're talking about?
Right now, in my opinion, the Democratic Party should be two parties and the Republican Party should be two parties. And when I say that, most people know exactly what I'm talking about. And then there should be a fifth party in the middle. And that would be a relatively accurate description of where 85% of Americans are, and would be a much more functional, representative, resilient system. Now, how do you get from our current dysfunctional, gridlocked, polarized two-party system to a system like the one I just described? With great difficulty. But I think the biggest step you take is going from two to three parties, which would improve the dynamic immeasurably, if only because then each party might have to genuinely compete, as opposed to right now they can just bomb throw towards the other party and say, well, look at the extremists on that side.
But we do have third parties, right? We have a Green Party. We have a
Do
Libertarian.
we,
I mean,
Sarah?
they exist. They are on the ballot in some places. Because as somebody who flirted with libertarianism in my early life, I wouldn't vote for a libertarian from the Libertarian Party at this point. But why not those?
Well, to your point, libertarians, and I have many libertarian friends, are probably the most established third party in America. They are on the ballot in all 50 states. Their presidential candidate, Joe Jorgensen, got about 1% of the vote. And so you could say, well, we have a third party and that's handled. Or you could say, well, that party isn't necessarily contending, changing the fundamental political dynamic, making DC more functional. And so that's what I think a lot of people think when they think third party, is they think a third party that changes the dynamic for the better and maybe even wins races around the country, wins seats in Congress, maybe even wins the White House.
But what do you think of when you think of a third party then?
I think of a third party that is improving the political dynamic and making it so the parties have to compete for our votes in a genuine way, which they do not have to right now. The gerrymandering and redistricting has resulted in 90% of congressional seats now being safely Democratic or Republican. And so think about that. If you're listening to this, it probably represents your district as well, where your representative does not need to actually worry about the other party defeating them. They just need to worry about placating and pleasing the hyper partisans in their own wing. And is that a healthy system? And so you need a more functional system where the parties have to genuinely compete and earn our votes, as opposed to just expecting us to fall in line because of the way the lines are drawn.
Okay, well, let's test this theory a little bit with voters. Over the last couple of weeks, we've been talking to Democrats, Trump voters, and swing voters, and asking them what they think about third parties. And unsurprisingly, it sounded like the swing voters were the most open to the potential of a third party. Let's listen.
I think the reason I never vote third party is because I immediately equate it with just throwing my vote away. So I think if there could be just more of like a strength in numbers, how many other people are feeling that same way? So if we all rally together around one normal human being, that could maybe cause a change.
Yeah, I agree. I'm not a career politician.
Right.
I'm so tired of the career politicians.
I'm tired of it too.
What if someone were to come to the table, be kind of a centrist and say, okay, I am pro-police. I believe in adequately funding the police. And at the same time saying January 6th stuff was just absolutely crazy, or you should get vaccinated, just someone that maybe would meet the middle 50% of America.
Yeah, but I feel like now the state of the union, I think more people would gravitate towards a third party. I feel like more people would be open to it now because this is clearly not working. But I think a lot of people would be open to that at this point.
Okay, so these are our swing voters. And it makes sense that people who voted for Trump in 2016 and then voted for Biden in 2020, they're like totally fed up with their options. They always talk about lesser of two evils. But I mean, they really only represent roughly 4 million voters, those swing voters. So when you listen to them, I know they sound like your people and like they're making the argument, Andrew, that you think is compelling, but do you think there's enough of them?
Well, there's a growing number all the time, and I think they suggested this, but you can see that in the polling, Sarah, where the number of self-described independents now is up to 50%, which is higher than it's been. The percentage of Americans who say they want a choice, aside from the two parties, is over 60%. These numbers are not normal. They're abnormally high. And so the interest level is growing every day. There are a lot of disaffected Republicans. There's an increasing number of disaffected Democrats. And the single biggest threshold question you can answer is what the initial focus group participant was talking about, which is, are you throwing your vote away? If you had a candidate or campaign where people felt they were contending and could win, then you would see their support shoot up very, very quickly.
Yeah, what she said was they would rally around like one normal human being, which sort of gets me to the question of like, who is the person that creates the conditions where a third party could happen, right? So we saw it happen in France, specifically kind of around a Macron figure. And when you ask these voters, kind of like, what kind of a person would this be? Here, listen to what they say.
I don't remember this because I was a child, but it seemed that everyone loved Kennedy. Kennedy was like, he was young. He had young kids in the Oval Office. We need someone that's charismatic that people can really relate to, like middle America, that we're raising our families. We have these same issues that maybe instead of the lobbyists getting in your ear and giving you all this money, we need someone that's more like us.
I can talk about issues all day long and promise you this, that, and the other thing. I don't believe half of what it is. So I want somebody that has run a company that seems personable and diplomatic and cares about the world and cares about starving people and just cares. I'll vote for that person. How about Bill Gates or his ex-wife? I'd vote for one of them just because.
The one point you made earlier about, a big name person with the recognition of a Gates or something like that. Sad to say, I think that might be necessary for a third party to have a real presence and a real significance.
Okay, Andrew, so I'm pretty skeptical that Bill Gates or his ex-wife are going to connect with the majority of middle America as they requested. But what about The Rock? Or like just tell me, who is the person that you think would galvanize enough of Americans to create this third party?
I think one figure that you can easily slot in for the purpose of this exercise is Mark Cuban, who has run significant businesses, is a very familiar figure to a lot of Americans. He just started a drugstore that makes generic drugs available essentially at cost, which unfortunately is a very, very small fraction of what most Americans are paying because people are getting gouged. And so he would check a lot of the boxes these people just named, which is business leader, recognized, relatively normal seeming for a public figure, has a youngish family, which he does have. I think someone like Mark would rally 30% of Americans very, very quickly. And there's polling that backs that up.
Yeah, and I mean, I know these people are not interchangeable, but I followed the Howard Schultz campaign very closely.
Yeah, I know both of these human beings. They're not the same guy.
Yes, I've met both of them too. They are most certainly not the same. I don't know. It's just like it was such a catastrophic failure, the Schultz campaign. And, I got to tell you, I was with Schultz one night when he was in Philadelphia giving a book talk. And I would say that the room was filled mainly with Democrats who came up to him to say that they liked him and that they hoped to God he wouldn't run, that they just thought it would be a terrible idea for him to run.
Well, that was the mood of the country at that time, Sarah, which was Trump was in office and Democrats were like, please, 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 let's get him out. And Howard seemed like he was going to take energy from that effort. So that's what he encountered. I think things are a bit different now than they were then.
Tell me why.
Well, I think part of it is that the parties are playing you lose, I lose while we're doing the losing. And so right now, Joe Biden and the Democrats are in charge. I think they're going to have a very, very hard time in November. And if things don't improve dramatically, like a tough time in November 24. And so if you had a figure, let's call him Donald Trump, coming the other side, he would probably be a favorite. And so if you're in that situation, then you might be looking for someone who can help change that dynamic. Whereas during the Schultz campaign, it was the opposite situation.
So you think if we rerun the 2020 election and we've got Biden versus Trump, you think that's the conditions in which a third party candidate could emerge potentially?
Well, certainly, I think if it's those two candidates, then there's going to be a third party candidate, and that person's going to start out with 20 to 25% of the vote and just go up from there. Because, I mean, Joe's going to be 82 in 24. Trump will be 77. And I saw some polling that said over half of Americans don't want either of them. So if you had a Mark Cuban run against those two, I think he'd win.
Yeah, I got to tell you, you're right. I talk to Democratic voters all the time in these focus groups, and they do not want to see Joe Biden run a second time. The Republicans, though, the Trump voters, you got plenty of them that want to see Trump run again. Now, it is not the majority, but he would win a Republican primary in a walk. And the people who don't want to see him run again, it's not because necessarily they don't like him. And this is, I think, where I've gotten sort of skeptical of a bit of the third party thing is I know that in your world and in my world, there are a lot of these disaffected Republicans. And I think we've got enough for like a really raging dinner party. I'm just not sure we've got enough for a political party.
I think we have enough for a political party, but we'd have to prove it out. And I see some of the same numbers that you see, but you're not looking at peeling off half of Republicans in this scenario. What percentage do you think would consider, for example, either an independent figure like a Mark Cuban or a moderate Republican figure like an Adam Kinzinger? If that was presented to them, if it's not half of Republicans, I think it's maybe a third. And if you had a third of Republicans that were willing to consider this other option, plus independents, plus a similar proportion of Democrats, I think you can get there.
Okay. Well, let's see. Let's dig into this a little bit more with the voters. So the swing voters were receptive because these are kind of the homeless tribe right now. But there was only a little bit of receptivity among a few of the Democrats and a couple of the MAGA voters. But let's listen to the Dems first.
But I think having a third party in there, you'd have to find someone who could pull from both Democratic and Republican parties in order to make a more unified society.
AOC mentioned once before that if we had multiple parties, she wouldn't be the same party as Joe Biden. It's because within the Democratic Party, there's two separate parties within it. And that makes it really hard because it's that kind of transition between this newer generation, the older one is still holding on. It makes it hard to make any progress. And then on the other side, Republicans, they're like one way or the highway.
So let me just tell you what I'm hearing and what I felt like I heard from these voters. It seems like there's kind of two ways that both the Democrats and the Republicans think about third parties. So one is a centrist party that appeals to the broad middle. And then the other is like you break off the progressives from the moderates on the Dem side, and then you break off like the MAGA from the establishment on the right. Which is it? Which do you think is the more viable path? A single third party that appeals to the broad middle? Or are we looking at a situation where we need national ranked choice voting so that we can have 5 major political parties competing?
I think that you have a broad party that appeals to the middle, and that leads you to ranked choice voting and a multi-party system. I think we should have ranked choice voting in every election, federal and local. I just don't see a downside. I mean, you just vote for who you want, and then the winner has to get over 50%. No more spoiler effect, greater diversity of opinion, more collegial, less negative campaigning. It's just a pure win for everybody. Unfortunately, there are a lot of folks in power who just don't like competition and of both parties. That's something that both parties can agree on is competition for them is bad. And so you need to create a different dynamic for there to be genuine competition between the parties. And I think the path there is a broad third party.
Do you think this is like soon? Like, you think this is a 2024 possibility? Because I guess this is where if it's Biden and Trump again, I do think you're right. I think there's probably somebody who looks at that field and says, look at these two 80-year-olds who have both failed in their own way. And, some charismatic 55-year-old tries to take a shot at it.
Yeah, then does really well, but continue. I like where you're going, Sarah, but keep going.
But then let's get into the practical side of that, right? So both the Republican and the Democrat would go through a primary. The system's not really set up for this third-party person. They'd have trouble getting on the debate stage. The current structure is set up for the two-party system, and it's very difficult, even for an outsider, to sort of break into that system.
I think it's easier than ever as someone who went through a version of this process. But let's play this out for a second. You mentioned the debates. The rules for the debates are that if you're at 15% or over, you can make the general debate stage. And in the scenario where describing, this person is 15% and up, and so they make the debate stage. But what's interesting is that at this point, the Republicans are threatening to boycott the debates, so there are no presidential debates. I'm going to suggest to everyone that if you have a third-party candidate, then the Republican for sure shows up, because the last thing they'd want is just to have Joe Biden and Mark Cuban debating, and then everyone's like, I guess these are our choices. So then Trump would show up. I mean, that's just one illustration. But in this day and age, it's so much easier for someone to get attention. They don't necessarily need to go through the same rigmarole that has been in place around these presidential primary debates. I want you to imagine the Republican primary debates of Trump versus Chris Christie, Mike Pompeo, Mike Pence, etc. Are you really going to be watching those debates and learning a lot, or excited to watch those debates, or the rest of it? You know what I mean? Like, this process has become so skewed that right now, if you had an outsider, they could just go on YouTube and they could probably rack up a similar number of views.
Yeah, I think there's truth to the fact that we are in a disruptive period. And the point about the Republicans, like, they have pulled out. They're not threatening. They're out of the Presidential Debate Commission, which does kind of throw into turmoil like the old structures and conventions. Like, I don't know how debates are going to go going forward, but it's not going to be by the Presidential Debate Commission. So presumably there is an opportunity to disrupt that. I want to get through the MAGA voters really quickly and just on how they kind of think about the third party thing. And it goes to maybe my number one reason that I'm so skeptical, which is that I think that a majority of especially Republicans are perfectly happy with Trump's version of the Republican Party. Let's listen to the MAGAs.
The only thing I can think of is like the MAGA Republicans are sort of unofficially making a third party because they're like splitting with the establishment people and then making Democrats win. If we could just get rid of the establishment.
I'd love to see a third party that takes votes away from the Democratic Party, which would make it easier for Republicans to get elected. Kind of like 92 with Ross Perot, and they say that's how Clinton got into office in 92.
Right. So these guys do go right to the spoiler problem, which you've raised and which would be one of my major concerns about 2024 rerun. I mean, I just think anything that throws that would make it easier for Donald Trump to win, freaks me out. It's like something that's very hard to know how it would play out. I love Justin Amash, but I argued forcefully back in 2020 for him not to run as a third party candidate because I thought that it was very unclear which party he would pull from.
I think Amash probably pulls from the right? I mean, he's a libertarian, former Republican. I'm an Amash fan too. I like this. Let's play this one out. But
I know, and you ran in a Democratic primary. This is my point. I think it's actually a misnomer or just like a misunderstanding that if John Kasich or Justin Amash, a lot of these sort of center-right people, there's this idea that it would fracture the Republican Party more. And I do not necessarily think that's true at all. I think there are a lot of conservative Democrats, maybe far more than there are moderate Republicans, and that they could have easily tipped the scales for Trump.
It's interesting because I feel like you are yourself a moderate Republican, and that if there was a choice between Justin Amash and Donald Trump, you'd choose Justin Amash. So I just can't imagine that there's only one of you, Sarah. There might not be like 51% of you.
Well, hold on. Now you've just made my point, which is I voted for Joe Biden. I am a moderate Republican, but I was willing to vote for Joe Biden, as did many moderate Republicans who hated Donald Trump. And if we had all gone third party, that might have tipped the scales actually for Trump.
I see what you're saying. You don't think that there is like a set of people that would not accept Joe Biden, but would accept Justin Amash?
No, I think there's a set of people who, given the choices between, let's say, Joe Biden in the Democratic Party or Donald Trump, that even if you were a moderate Republican, what a lot of moderate Republicans did is they voted affirmatively for Joe Biden. And what that did was it gave Biden net votes, which was it took one from Trump, people who'd voted for Trump the first time, and it put him, now I didn't vote for Trump the first time, but it took votes from Trump and it gave them to Biden. And that's where you see the swing from, Trump wins by 80,000 votes across 3 states to Joe Biden wins by, I don't know what it was, like 160,000 votes across 3 states. Maybe it was a little bit, maybe it was more than that, Biden's win. But
it was actually less than that. It was like 45,000.
All right. The point is, I just think it is very simple to do in your head. Well, John Kasich's a Republican and Justin Amash was a libertarian who was a Republican for a long time. And so if he ran as an independent, he would pull from the right. And what they do is siphon votes from people who would otherwise be comfortable voting for a Democrat in a one-on-one scenario. And 2, that they pull more from the left than people realize, because I think there's a lot more conservative Democrats than people realize.
Well, you do have insight that others don't, but I can't help but think that there must be a figure that moderate Republicans who would not accept a Democratic candidate would be willing to consider. Like, I'll throw an Adam Kinzinger in the mix. In another era, I think he'd be very, very center of the party mainstream. And I can't help but think that there are a lot of Republicans who are looking at Adam Kinzinger and say, I'm totally fine with Adam Kinzinger in a way that they might not be fine with Democrat TBD or Joe Biden.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, just look at Adam Kinzinger today. He's being run out of the Republican Party. Republicans tend to hate him, and Democrats like him.
I feel like that's Republican primary voters, which it's like, because if you look at our incentives, again, you're looking at, I don't think, that's like the entire party. I mean, he might be run out of the party by hyper partisan activist types who right now are very, very Trumpy. Anyway.
Well, let's just take the spoiler question, because this is the number one thing that comes up. When you ask voters, what do they think about a third party? Spoilers is what they talk about. Let's listen.
You mentioned taking away votes. The Green Party from Ralph Nader definitely affected the 2000 election, but then the Green Party came and went.
Like when we have an independent run, they just take away from the Democrats.
I can give you an example where it helped. Bill Clinton wouldn't have won if Ross Perot wasn't running.
What do you think the cadence is? Do you think we need ranked choice voting before we really have third parties that can be viable? Or do you think we can jump straight to third parties and that creates the conditions where people understand why we need ranked choice voting?
My preference is that we get ranked choice voting first. But what I've observed is that parties don't want to do anything unless they're kind of forced to. So I think that you're going to have a very, very significant unity ticket, independent candidate, third party movement in 2024. And then you're going to see ranked choice voting become front and center because the parties will look at it and say, well, I'd rather change the process than have my prospects disrupted and spoiled in this way. But I think the appetite is higher than it's ever been. The faith in our current party system is lower than it's ever been. And this is not going to change, especially if you do wind up with Trump Biden too. I think if you have an independent candidate that's under the age of 70, they start out with 25% and go up from there.
I don't know who the person is, but I do think if you had an outside candidate who is charismatic and you were rerunning the 2020 election, maybe that breaks everything wide open and creates the shift. But it would sort of have to be those conditions. Because here's the thing. If it's Ron DeSantis, the Republicans will happily vote for him. There's not then an appetite for something else. People will be happy to vote for Ron DeSantis.
If you look up right now, you just said it earlier, Sarah, I think if Trump runs, he gets the nomination and he has the money. I don't see why he doesn't run. So he probably gets a nomination. And then that's that side. On the other side, there are a lot of people who don't want Joe Biden to run again. But what we're all hearing is that Joe thinks he's the only one who can defeat Trump. So if it's Trump again, then Joe says it has to be me again. Now, you can look at that and say, well, maybe that won't happen, but you'd have to admit it seems like the most likely scenario at this point. And when you're talking about the future of democracy, the last thing you would ever do is be like, maybe it won't happen. Like you look up and say, well, geez, we better start planning as if this really could happen because it seems like a likelihood at this point.
So I completely agree with that planning. I will say, though, that I make this point all the time, but I don't make it in the context of a third party. I make it in the context of the Democratic Party, because I completely agree there's not going to be ranked choice voting anytime soon. And so you either have to have somebody who can transcend politics and parties in such a way that they don't need any of the institutional support that the party apparatus brings. But to me, there is a reason that Donald Trump decided to take over the Republican Party. And that is because he wanted an institution to occupy. And he just did. That's what he did. He just took it over. And I feel like the Democrats have a really interesting thing going on in you as a former Democratic presidential candidate. I would love to know what you think is going to happen, because what's crazy to me right now is democracy's on the line. Joe Biden is a very old man, not popular whatsoever. He's got a deeply unpopular vice president. And there doesn't appear to be a bench. I don't know what the mechanism is for them to figure out how to run somebody else. And so to me, it actually seems like the most viable thing is for somebody to do what Trump did to the Democrats. Because everybody now who's a Democrat's going to have to be like, well, you can't go over Kamala. And like, I don't know, what about Pete? Who's Joe Biden going to endorse? They treat it like it's all the same. And so like, I agree with you on one sense that there's like prime for disruption, but why shouldn't that disruption be Mark Cuban taking over the
Within the Democratic Party? Well, one could argue that Bernie tried to do that twice and came close, There were a lot of forces within the party that tried very hard to keep that from happening that I think would be there and present still. And I also think Bernie is somewhat singular in that people are right now trying to figure out who the next Bernie is and will be. And I'm not sure that's clear. So the Democratic Party, in many ways, it's like the last of the institutionalists. It's like the apologists for the institutions. And I think they will be the last to admit that things are failing. And their primary electorate is somewhat distinct in that sense, where even if a lot of Americans are like, all right, let's try something new, like I think the Democratic primary electorate will still try and hang on. So it's a tough set of questions to answer for the Democrats because, like you said, you have Joe Biden. He's there. He's not super popular at the moment, but Kamala polls 5 points worse than him. So there's no heir apparent. And so if Joe does step aside, you wind up with a competitive primary because Kamala does not clear the field. And who emerges from that? No one knows, which is one reason why I think the most likely scenario is that it's Joe again, because people will look and say, well, I don't want it to be Kamala, so I guess we'll go with Joe. There are folks that are pushing for some of the other candidates in the field, but it's not clear that that person is going to defeat Trump or be poised to do so. So it's a bit of like a zone of uncertainty over there. And that's one reason why I think asking someone to come in and say, like, I'm going to take this uncertainty and disrupt it, especially if, by the way, Joe decides to run again, because then there's not going to be a true primary.
Well, I got to tell you, MAGA voters and Democratic voters agree on almost zero things in these focus groups. But one thing that they did agree on is that a third party was never going to happen. Let's listen.
I mean, we already have a Libertarian Party. So, I mean, we already have them, but just demographically and numbers wise, there are not enough people in those other buckets that could seriously challenge the election at this point.
I don't think it's worked well when it's been done in other countries. I don't think it worked well.
I mean, it'll never happen.
I would think a more realistic and quicker option would be to just revamp the whole party. Like get more of the America First Republicans in and start primarying the establishment. I think that's a more realistic option.
I got to tell you, I love that last quote from that woman because Donald Trump wanted to do exactly what you're talking about. He threatened to start an America First party. And it's one of the ways that he has held the Republican Party in his thrall because they know if he goes off and starts another party, that's going to be the majority of the Republican Party and that they don't have a coalition then. And I guess that's part of what freaks me out about this, where it's so uncertain. I mean, I'm like very up for blue skying because I agree we're in a very precarious moment. With 70% of Republican voters believe that the election was stolen. And the majority of them want to see Trump run again or like Trump perfectly well. And they want the America First vision. I hear that all over the focus groups, the Trump voters. They love the America First vision. So, like, if you split everybody up, why aren't they the biggest coalition in America?
This is one reason why I think you're going to see a third party movement arise pretty quick, is because you have Donald Trump and the people that support him playing an outsized role in our politics. I think we can all sense that. So the question is, how do you address it? If you're the Democrats, you think, well, let's just defeat him. The problem is that might not be in the cards. And I'm going to suggest that the stakes are incredibly high where, I think a Trump second term would be completely calamitous. And so if you look at that picture and you say, well, what are your options? I think it's going to happen because we're overdue for a political realignment. If you look at our country's history, Abraham Lincoln was a third party candidate who won a 4-candidate race with 39% of the vote. And that was a very difficult time for the country. Unfortunately, I think we're getting back to that point. This is that kind of time.
All right, last question. And if Joe Biden and Donald Trump rerun the 2020 election, you can count me as very third party curious with you over here. But tell me this, what are you going to do? Is your plan now to lead a third party movement? Is it to recruit candidates? Is it to run yourself as a third party? Like, how are you thinking about it?
I'm in party building mode. The Forward Party is welcome for everyone who wants a new approach to our politics that's positive and unifying and just wants to solve problems and not get caught in ideological back and forths. There are a lot of Americans who resemble that, and that number goes up every single day. So that's what I'm about. And it's good fun because the people that are attracted to the Forward Party tend to be really principled, patriotic, good people who are just sick of this dynamic and know we deserve better. I've run businesses before. There is no business leader who would look at our political system and be like, yeah, this is working. You would just be like, okay, like this is completely not working. So let's change this and move this and do that. And it's strange to me, Sarah, how we've just been so beaten down into accepting something that's threatening to destroy us, really. So millions of Americans want better. We can do better. And that's what I'm committed to helping build with the Forward Party. There's a better way forward for us and our kids.
Well, Andrew, what I want to say the most to you is the thing that I truly admire is sort of is the lack of complacency that you have, because I think that the complacency in our politics is killing us and is allowing us to kind of be slowly marched into this political purgatory that we now exist in. While I don't know that I agree with you on some of the particulars, I certainly agree that action is much better than inaction, and that we should be thinking about new ways to approach our politics in this moment, because I agree with you, it is ripe for some disruption. Andrew Yang, thank you so much for being here today. Thanks for joining us and watching the focus groups. I really appreciate it. And I hope you'll come back again soon.
Yeah, I would love that, Sarah. Thank you.
And thanks to all of you for listening to another episode of The Focus Group. Make sure to join us next week, because we are going to start doing our first breakdowns of the primaries with undecided voters. We've got Ohio next week, one of the most exciting Republican primaries out there. So I hope you'll join us, and make sure that you go give us a rating on Apple Podcasts or follow us wherever you get your podcasts. We'll see you next week.